This is Keys to the Shop, episode 447, Understanding the Business of Specialty Coffee with Maxwell Dashwood. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I am your host for this show. Thank you so much for joining me. Do subscribe to Keys to the Shop if you can, and always stay updated with new episodes come out. And I would really appreciate anybody on the other end of this microphone sharing Keys to the Shop so that other people and other businesses can benefit from the collection of wisdom that Keys to the Shop has developed over the past 7 years. Thank you so much, everybody, for doing that. I also want to make you aware of the upcoming coaching groups that are going to be launching in March. We already have one in progress. They're called Key Holder Coaching Groups. You know, Keys to the Shop is a consulting company as well, on top of doing this podcast. And part of that service is this newly launched Key Holder Coaching Group. It's peer-to-peer, existing coffee shop operators, owners who want to just get together and solve problems and really help each other succeed in the business of coffee. If that is something that appeals to you and you want to have that community and problem solving, encouragement, accountability, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com and I can get your name on the list for early access to the applications for joining these groups. Whereas we have one right now, there are going to be several groups. And so you have a great opportunity of joining one of these cohorts. So again, Chris, CHRIS at keystotheshop.com to learn more about key holder coaching groups. Now I want to talk to you all about the Ground Control Brewer, groundcontrol.coffee. Go there and learn about this because it is the future of coffee brewing in coffee shops. It offers next-level coffee extraction technology for your cafe to make the best batch brew coffee you've ever had, but it also allows you to make tea, batched iced lattes, and batched cold brew. And again, go find more over at groundcontrol.coffee. Their new brewer is 45% less than the Cyclops brewer, the original Ground Control, with early bird special pricing, and it's much shorter. It's actually 24 inches high, so you could fit this anywhere in the cafe. It's got 30% higher volume for batch espresso, cold brew concentrate, and is cloud connected to a smart dispenser that tracks all your brewing data. Lot to love here. The concentrates for iced lattes, 8-minute cold brew, best batch brew coffee possible. This is an awesome choice for your coffee shop. Go learn more again over at groundcontrol.coffee. As the industry continues to innovate and the industry continues to reach more people, we have to offer lots of options for customers who have different tastes, different preferences, and restrictions. That's why it's so exciting to have a product like the Barista Series from Pacific. So the Barista Series is created for baristas and is approved by baristas all over the world that love to serve great plant-based beverages to their customers day in and day out. It stands up to the heat from steaming, produces awesome texture for latte art, and when you talk about flavor balance with a plant-based beverage, sometimes it's a little spotty, it's a little bit too much on the plant side of things. This is a beautiful harmony, each of their products with the coffee being the highlight. So go to pacificfoodservice.com for more information and get samples, try it for yourself. I think you're really going to love this, and so will your customers. And if you're going to serve plant-based beverages to your customers, I think it should be the Barista Series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today we are going to be talking about the business of specialty coffee. Of course, that's a huge topic, but our guest today has an incredible amount of experience in the business of specialty coffee, not only from a personal level entrepreneurially, but also just the ability to see greater trends and have been a participant in the greater global industry for quite a long time. We're talking with Maxwell Dashwood. Maxwell Dashwood's coffee journey began in Melbourne, Australia in 2007. Upon returning to the UK, he co-managed a coffee events company and then opened Colonna Smalls in the city of Bath. It was a coffee shop with a focus on curated, changing coffee menus. Maxwell founded and runs Colonna Coffee roastery and has recently opened a Colonna and Smalls location in London. He works on different coffee research and development projects And on top of that, he's a very acclaimed figure in the industry. Maxwell is a 3-time winner of the UK Barista Championships. He has authored academic papers on coffee. He's also the co-author of Water for Coffee, which is a study on the impact of water on coffee taste, and the Coffee Dictionary, which is an accessible guide to coffee terminology. And now, this most recent book, The Business of Specialty Coffee, which combines his business experience with an exploration of the coffee supply chain. And this book is just packed with an incredible amount of experience, wisdom, research that is going to give every reader not just a big picture view of the industry, but also a lot of great practical takeaways for their individual place within the supply chain and the greater industry. And that's kind of what we talk about today. We're going to cover the evolution of how this book came to be. We're going to talk about the supply chain. We'll talk about coffee shops, technology, automation, accessibility, and everything in between. And I'm so excited to share this conversation with you, a really great one to kind of help round out the year as we end 2023 with a bang. Super excited to have had Maxwell on the show. So let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation about the business of specialty coffee with Maxwell Dashwood. All right, Maxwell, such a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be asked to come and speak to you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, as am I. And there is so much to cover. I mean, there is probably about 5 different podcast episodes that are contained within the projects that you've undertaken in the span of your career. And that's what's so exciting to me about this book that you've just put out about the business of coffee and business of specialty coffee, because it comes from such a range and depth of experience, both as a participant in the trenches for so many years, as well as an observer and a student of the industry. And so I think a good place to talk at first would be, how did you, in the beginning, discover coffee and your affinity for it, and then it eventually became sort of a business for you?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because looking back on it, mine is the journey of a curious person who likes to explore things and was kind of excited and willing to do that through business as well. There was no 5-year plan. As I've been in coffee for longer, I do find myself planning a little bit further ahead. I think that's a natural business thing that you start doing the longer you're in it. If I go back right to the beginning, it was 2007 in Melbourne, Australia. I come from an arty background. My father's a sculptor. I was always brought up with this idea that you could go and do your own thing. And, maybe one route was sort of academic or traditional career structure, but also entrepreneurial. My dad left school when he was 14 and became a sculptor. But actually, that wasn't until he was 30. He worked on the Forestry Commission, which is south of the UK. There's a place called the New Forest. And he's in what you would call a naturalist. He loves nature and birds. He always kept falcons. And all of his sculpture that he's known for is all around birds. But so I came up around this sort of creative culture and this idea that you could be entrepreneurial. And I decided not to go to university, did a bunch of traveling. And my first real job was portraiture. I would paint people. My dad, I think, has only just got over the fact that I went into coffee and didn't stay in art. I was drawn to coffee in a bunch of different ways. The first thing I loved wasn't coffee, it was hospitality. I was working a job as an artist, like a lot of struggling artists do, making money on the side, doing bar work or restaurant work. And I absolutely loved it. I loved the interaction with people, but also the idea that you had a space that people came into, and it was partly product, partly people, partly space, created this unique interaction experience. And I guess it was a little bit more tangible than art. Art could kind of be whatever you want it to be. But this was like, okay, how do we make this space and people's experiences in it great? And, art often is quite solitary, depends on the art. But I found myself loving the hospitality. And actually, as I got busier doing the artwork, I had to stop doing the hospitality. And then I thought, that's what I sort of realized to myself. I don't want to do artwork. I love hospitality. But I felt like I didn't know what product I would build it around. And I met my partner, Leslie. We got married and she wanted to do a bunch of traveling. So we did 6 months in India and ended up with a work visa in Australia. I'd already traveled and spent time in Australia, but I'd already used my work visa in New Zealand working on vineyards. So anyway, I had a work visa and we ended up in Melbourne and I got a job in a cafe in the central business district. And very quickly, it was clear to me that if I was going to work in this cafe, I had to make coffee. And actually the expectation this was not a high-end coffee shop at all, but the expectation was high for a decent standard of coffee making. This was interesting to me because I hadn't experienced this back home. And the more I spoke to customers, the more they would share their interest in coffee. And I was becoming interested in the process, but still not the culinary side. At this point, this shop had a more traditional Italian blend. And it was the process and the culture that was interesting. And one of the regulars said to me, look, I can see you're interested, Maxwell. You should go up the road to this place called Brother Baba Boudin. And it was kind of like a speakeasy. I don't think there was any signage. And I went in and there was this person in there who said to me, well, why don't you try this Kenyan espresso we have on? It was kind of under the counter. Everything at the time there was kind of under the counter. Yeah, I had this coffee and it blew my mind. It blew my mind that not only did I love the way it tasted, I often think specialty coffee is kind of self-selecting, right? Which is if you taste these flavor profiles and you love them, you're drawn to it. And so that makes sense. And what I liked quite naturally sat with the scoring system. But also the fact that I had to come around the world, I'd had to discover it. I like to learn, I like to research and study things. And it felt like there was an inflection point that I'd stumbled across. And cafes are really interesting. And I think this is still the case, is that for most cafes, treating a product as a culinary product is a challenge because, the model most of us are building our shops around is effectively this quick fast food Starbucks interaction model. And it felt like there was a bit of friction there. And I found that interesting. And from a hospitality point of view, I was like, this is an interesting challenge. I can learn about this product. I can develop my own experience with it. But there's also a challenge here, a hospitality challenge. Because I was a big believer that the friction wasn't because people weren't into it, it's because they're walking into those shops for a different experience. So I became very obsessed with the idea that you could build a concept cafe where that interaction around coffee, that discussion around coffee was the primary goal, not the secondary goal. So yeah, that's how I started. Came back to the UK, opened an events business thinking that would be easier. It wasn't, but you learn. You have to pay your pitch fees for the event. So if I was going to do Glastonbury Music Festival, for example, most people know that festival, biggest in the world, I would pay my pitch fee like a year in advance. If I didn't get the right pitch, I wouldn't make any money. And actually the events that were better for business were agricultural events or tractor shows. But we did that for a bit and it's challenging because it's all predominantly in the summer. We made some money from it. It worked. But I also realized it wasn't the right vehicle for me personally to explore my interest in coffee. The odd person was very excited to find this specialty coffee in a field. But it was clearly not the best environment for it. And I was like, okay, I want a shop. And I actually distinctly remember I'd been making coffee with a queue until 6 a.m. in a VIP area of a music festival called Global Gathering. And a lot of people there were manipulating their psychology with substances. So this guy was off of his face, and he sort of just half destroyed our stand. We used to build like a cafe in a field rather than just a van. And he was just trying to get as much sugar to sort of balance out his equilibrium. And I just remember thinking, I think this isn't the right environment. I think I need a destination shop somewhere. We carried on doing the events and looked for somewhere to open the shop. And I wasn't from Bath, which is where Colonna & Small's, the first original, it still is, and was opened back in 2009. I could look back and say I did a bunch of demographic research, and I did a bit, but it was kind of a feeling. And it was an interesting city because it's compact, it's small, it's got the university. A lot of people don't realise Bath has quite big creative and media industries as well, tourism. And the first shop was tiny, 5 seats. We lived above it. It was almost like it couldn't fail. My partner would go out and work another job. And I think on day one, we made like 50 quid, and it just sort of snowballed from there. And one of my themes in the book is, especially when it comes to bricks and mortar shops, I still believe if you're a passionate owner operator, you have a competitive advantage, because I don't believe that's that common. And I think if you build something interesting, it's like a magnet and people will come to you. I think there's limits to that. I don't think you can do destination coffee shops like you can with restaurants. And there's friends of mine who run Monmouth in London said they found that with their roastery. Like, you can test the limits of how far people are willing to travel with coffee. And then it just sort of evolved from there. For the first 6 years, the shop to me was a collaborative space. Yes, it was a coffee shop and people were coming in and using it as a cafe, but we would experiment and play with how we used menus and how we spoke to customers. And then I started taking part in barista competitions because that seemed to be a place where a lot of curiosity was explored, a lot of conversation was happening, because there didn't used to be as many books or as much content. It's such a different place now. But that shop was that magnet. And one of my collaborators, Christopher H. Hendon, who's now a professor out in the States, he was a customer doing his PhD. And it was him I had a question for about water. And I said, well, the coffee industry seems to use this little TDS meter to measure water. What do you think about that? To me, it seems like a number, but what's it really telling us? And that turned into the academic paper on water. I used that at the World Championships in Rimini for my routine. I always felt when I did barista comps, I was definitely at odds a bit with the format in that I wanted to use the stage to explore an idea, but it was difficult to do that within the framework of the competition. But I'm still very glad I did that because, for me and my career, it was much better to stand on stage and try and, crowbar in a narrative around water than it was to do the same routines that may have been easier to score. And then what we noticed was that the problem with academic literature is it often asks a very specific question that looks at a very specific phenomena, and it misses a lot of the color and a lot of the wider scope. And I was frustrated that people kind of misinterpreted the research. So Water for Coffee, the book, was self-published and born out of an eagerness to tell a wider theory of water. It's amazing to think about how that project snowballed, to be honest. And we're actually working on Water for Coffee 2 right now, which is well overdue. That led on to other academic research, like the freezing paper. Freezing coffee beans pre that paper was something that had gone out of fashion. People's relatives had done back in the day, but it was frowned upon. And that's sort of, again, it's interesting when you do this research. I'm not a prescriptive person. I think if it's not conclusive, you should say it's not conclusive. And a lot of academic research, taste is so difficult in coffee that if you want conclusive taste results, you're probably not going to get them, as in you're not going to get everyone to agree on what best or good is. So really, you're looking at a phenomena that occurs, and then you watch the coffee community take that research and decide how they'd like to apply it, which is really interesting. People definitely lent into freezing coffee for a bunch of reasons that make sense. So anyway, I've probably brought us up now to about 2015 when I decided to stop doing barista comps. From a business point of view, they took up so much energy, those competitions, that a lot of what I was interested in exploring as business projects, I just wasn't doing. And it was my shop, and then it was coffee competitions and research projects. And I do some collaborations and consultancy, and I took the opportunity to travel, for all of my critique of barista comps, which I am a heavy critique of how they could be better. I also got a lot from them. There's no doubt about that. And so then I would say from 2015, I was more focused on my businesses. And I read a paper, or it was just an article actually, about the fact that most entrepreneurial endeavor or innovation is done before someone's 35. And I thought it was interesting because the whole paper wanted to talk about how you change as you get older. But the thing that wasn't mentioned in the article, which for me is the biggest thing, is if you spend your 20s creating things, well, some of those things will turn into something you have to look after, which takes up your time. And you only have so much time. And so that's definitely something I've thought about a lot. And, I struggled a bit with a couple of years ago I got quite ill and had a bit of burnout, and I had to shrink things back down and say no to things and think more closely about how I spend my energy. But since 2015, I've been focusing on my businesses. I think creating things, for me personally, I find quite easy to get something started. I know that's not the same for everyone. For a lot of people, that's the hardest thing, making that first step. But actually nurturing and looking after something has sort of become more interesting to me. One of the reasons this book came about is there's clearly precedent for coffee business everywhere. There's loads of coffee businesses all around the world throughout the supply chain. There's obviously the most at both the cafe end and the farming end. And then in the middle, you have less operators in the middle because they need to be at more scale. There's clearly precedent there. I think for a lot of us in specialty, we're pursuing our passion and interest in the subject through a business. And I do believe firmly that understanding, creating something of value really for a customer is more valuable than understanding the nuts and bolts if you had to choose. But obviously, you need both, and your vision can't flourish without the fundamental business understanding. And then what I came to realize was actually we're all doing business on these pretty traditional business structures, which is farming and agriculture, finance, logistics, food manufacturing, hospitality, and retail. And actually, we can benchmark those, and they are difficult industries. They're quite lean, quite competitive, different elements of risk. I think over the years, I became more interested in going, well, okay, what does good look like for a coffee business? What's sustainable? What is the target profit? And how are these other businesses making that work? You'd look around and you'd wonder how they're making it work. I do think that, just through my own businesses demanding my attention more, but also my curiosity of the industry is I don't think the business is separate to the drink product taste side. You don't have one without the other. You go, okay, well, if I want to do certain projects and certain ideas, they have to stack up and make sense as a business, really. And so I became more and more interested in the business structure of the whole industry. And the more I spoke to people, it felt to me a lot of people's understanding of the coffee industry and how it works was through osmosis of branding and marketing or anecdotal conversation. And a lot of people had a lot of questions and were scratching their heads over a drink at the pub or something, or a barista competition. But it felt like that conversation, which is natural. The business conversation, of course, it's competitive, people looking after their own business. It felt like it wasn't out in the open as much. And I was actually debating this with a guy called Darcy, who runs Darcy's in Copenhagen, a couple of specialty coffee shops there. He actually wrote a book called Instant Coffee Shop, which is really good. How to open a coffee shop in 7 days. We were talking about the industry and this challenge. And he said, look, I think this sounds like a book. And I was like, oh, it's a good idea, Darcy. So that was the beginning of the book. He gave me that idea back in January. I wrote the book over 5 months, which was all consuming, really, because it's such a big topic. And it sort of spiraled the scope of it. And I had lots of contribution. And I say to people, when you write and publish something, it definitely makes you think about it differently. That's not just a book. That could be publishing anything. It could be a podcast, a video, a routine. And so the process of writing the book isn't just about saying, hey, here's what I've learned. The process of writing the book is me going on a journalistic or a study of the industry in a way that I hadn't done before.
Yeah, and that is something that I'm very interested in, because earlier on, as you're talking about your artistic background and sort of when I think of artistic perspective on things like business, I think in terms of connecting disparate ideas and seeing the meta narrative, the meta patterns, if you will, of something that is larger than yourself, but you're an individual participant in. So each little coffee shop is a part of a larger tapestry of the industry. And so from that perspective, you as an artist, like you said, you're at odds with, I like that phrase, at odds with a format. So you use your coffee shop to experiment with things. You use your routine to experiment with things. And it feels like a lot of businesses are doing this, but now later on in your career, you're talking about how there are business principles that you need to honor as part of this structure that will allow you to do those types of things sustainably. Of course, I suppose that doesn't just apply to retailers, but also to farmers and anyone else in the midst of the value chain here. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because I feel like a lot of people are artists who get into this and they have a grand vision. It's very palpable. There's a lot of values and mission here. But the importance of viewing coffee as a business and how that's not necessarily antithetical to the warm, fuzzy, passion that we have for coffee and what we want to accomplish with our brand. Because sometimes I feel like we pit them against each other, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely, Chris. I mean, the way you just described that resonated with me a lot. Listening to you speak, it was describing a lot of how I see the industry. That, I do my projects, which are my individual projects. My cafe is a private space that I invite people onto, and they come into that space to have an experience curated by me and engage with me. I don't represent the whole industry at all, but I have my project within it. For me personally, I'm always trying to understand both. This is what I'm doing, but what's the wider thing? And they can be different, but they also are interconnected. Absolutely agree. The business thing, obviously, growing up in an arty family, I think with fine art, so like sculpture or painting, there's a real friction and stress there between commerce and art, because there's a very common scenario where somebody's creative expression is not the most commercially successful, but they can use their creative abilities to do something often commission-based, or do something that a client wants, which wouldn't be their primary expression, but is almost like a service for the client. And that's where the friction comes from, this idea that you have to compromise your creativity to make a living. I don't think coffee is the same, in that there are definitely scenarios where there's things I'd like to do with coffee where I'm like, oh, that's a really cool idea. I got no idea how that would make money. So some of my R&D work I do, which is separate to my business, where I collaborate with a biotech scientist who hated biotech, invented a DNA analyzing machine, sold it all in COVID, and has invested all of his earnings into coffee R&D, whether it's coffee grinding or green coffee processing, all sorts. Some of the problems he solves in the pursuit of making a great cup of coffee are really interesting, but I just look at them and go, I just don't see how that's commercially viable. So there are those scenarios, but I would say on the whole, it's not that mutually exclusive, and simply understanding the rules of the playground you're in when you open a coffee business, and also embracing them and figuring out how you can, like a game mechanic, or a bit like doing the barista comp, really, how can we do both? How can we understand these rules and use them to our advantage? I don't think enough of us creatives or specialty coffee love passionate business owners embrace utilizing the rules of coffee business to our benefit, to embrace our vision. So at the end of the book, I have a little theoretical paragraph where I talk to the younger me, and I say to myself there, hey, Maxwell, it's going to be worth you really understanding the business mechanics behind what you're doing so that you can pursue your vision fully, and so that they tie into each other. You have success, which funds more creativity and more exploration of coffee. And the younger me is a bit annoyed and impatient and just says, no, I get it. I need to not lose money. I understand. And the older me would be more patient, saying, no. You need to go beyond that, right? You're a creative who wants to explore. You've brought to life the vision you have today. But as you continue to explore coffee, you're going to have ideas that you haven't even had yet, new things you want to explore. And what you need to do is create the success to explore those, almost like an R&D budget or something, right? Which is, if you do the maths on a piece of paper and you go, okay, I can just about make enough living here, that's probably not enough. I think it's about going, success here is going to allow me to do more with my vision. Now, we've all seen the stories that growth is often coincided with some kind of compromise, and it's almost like a fable where the growth and the success comes and the quality and the vision are compromised. I can definitely see that. That's more likely with investors who want a return or something as well. But I also don't think that's the blueprint here. I think what we're moving through now is a lot of passionate operators will work really hard for several years. They'll get tired. They'll be disappointed they haven't been able to do several things with their vision they wanted to do. But also, they may have children or a mortgage or whatever. And I think some people are calling this the fifth wave of coffee or the business of coffee. But I think in a maturing market, whether it's the whole market maturing or individual businesses going through this process, it's very natural to start caring and respecting the business side of what you do more.
Yeah, well said, because it's always been important and it will outlast the things that are passion projects that are a niche focus of yours for a while. And then the business makes itself known again and again and again. And as you see the cautionary tales of businesses who do actually reinforce that stereotype of growth equals compromise, it starts to burn in mature professionals, I would say. I use that term loosely here just to say that after a certain number of years, you're like you mentioned or hinted at earlier, your perspective changes and maybe you start to get a little bit more fascinated with the universals of the business. And so you want to innovate ways to make it not so, or how can we grow a business and have it be sustainable and not go down in quality, which I'm reminded of the conversation we had on Founder Friday with Roland Horn of Watch House, whose vision it is to do exactly that. I think that was mentioned in our conversation, that scale doesn't have to equal bad quality, and that the bigger you are, the more stuff you can do, which may or may not always be true. But I'm curious about the growth aspect of business, because that's what a lot of people are really gunning for. I mean, the early years sometimes are, people bear through it, they get through it because they look to the future years. But if those future years don't come, they are tempted to take on maybe too much investment or give away too much equity in their business, or they take out too big of a loan. Who knows what it is? But healthy growth in a business, I'm curious about your take on this. There's slow growth, there's fast growth. What is better, or is it just depend?
It's a really good question. I think often we talk about things like fast or slow growth, and one person's context for that is different to another's. As in, we think we're talking about the same thing, but we're not. Just in general in business, a lot of this is defined by expectation. So I'm talking to different coffee producers, and if I'm talking to a multi-generational coffee farmer whose family have multiple businesses in Latin America, coffee farming is one of them. The family is in a well-resourced position. This individual has gone to college in America, done an MBA there. They're coming back into that family business with some quite high expectations of what that business needs to give them personally for them to want to come back into the coffee business versus look at other industries. If we were to compare that to a smallholder farmer in rural Uganda, they would have very different expectations around success. But I think that's the same in America and the UK and global North and global South. Those expectations change. But if you're coming into coffee, for example, I mean, it's a well-trodden saying now, if your primary goal is to figure out some kind of career path to make the most money possible, you wouldn't go to coffee.
That's right? Yeah.
But, there's lots of other reasons why it's a really interesting, rewarding industry. And I think I came in it from hospitality. And, obviously, my father is a successful, renowned sculptor. But growing up, I saw the challenges of art, and I'm like, oof, like, so you could have some really bad years and some great years and a lot of unpredictability. And then I very quickly learned that hospitality, although I found it rewarding, was a challenging industry, and if you got everything right, you could have a successful business within the constraints of what that industry can afford. Success looks different to other industries. I'm not avoiding your question here. I'm trying to add this context because I think it's an important way to understand what we mean by growth and what we mean by success. One of my ideas in the book is, what even is a good coffee business? What does it look like?
Right.
Because you see a lot of people talking about, oh, it's a struggle, and then you've got someone else in the room who's making a tenth of their revenue, who would be thrilled with that revenue. And so obviously if you have investors and, equity or a lot of debt, obviously success has to be bigger to compensate for that, which I think is partly what you were suggesting before. But my general approach to this is saying, okay, unicorn businesses are very dangerous to look at. So by unicorn business, I mean winner bias. I mean the one massive success story that comes across everyone's table once in a blue moon. They are exciting and interesting. And this is the podcast, How I Built This, these kind of podcasts. But they're exciting because they're unusual. They're not a blueprint for others to learn from. I can't remember who I'm quoting here, but always look at the graveyard around the unicorn successes. So how many other businesses had a go at the same business model and failed? And this isn't to say we won't keep having unicorns. Of course we will. But they're high-risk models where there's not many winners. And I think a lot of us, when we talk about business in coffee, we don't think we're talking about that. We think we're talking about a community of business owners with different levels of risk, but one that lots of different people partake in as entrepreneurs or business owners. And so at the other end of the spectrum of a unicorn business, you have what I would call an average business. And I mean this statistically. So what is the average business? And it doesn't look that great, right? Because, if you're going to go, okay, what's the average profit of coffee shops? We're going to have a lot of coffee shops opening that never get the metrics right, don't get the right rent or don't get the right value proposition, and they close and they ran a loss. So that brings the average down. So between the average business and the unicorn business, you have what I would call a good business. Is there an archetypal good business? No, but they're the ones I'm interested in understanding from a growth point of view. So when you ask me the question about quick or slow growth, I'm interested in discussing a business example, a model, in the context of how did they achieve good. There's a famous saying that if you stand still in business, you die. I think that's where a lot of the desire for growth comes from, especially in a market that's growing quite fast. And specialty coffee globally does have good CAGR numbers, is identified as a fast growing market up until 2030. And that's another thing we have to talk about here with growth is often relative to the wider market, all the people you're competing against, the market opportunity. And I was speaking to the CEO of a very large coffee company, multi-billion-dollar coffee company the other day, and he said a couple of times in the conversation, when this is all over. And I was like, he's come from other industries, and he's saying this boom, at some point, the boom won't be a boom, and it will equalize out. That will happen, right? Which I thought was interesting. So a lot of people drawn to coffee since I've been in it, there's definitely an allure. People look at a market and go, oh, the numbers are good, there's growth there. There's a few chapters on this in the book. Just because a market shows overall good growth doesn't mean there's a great business opportunity. It could be that the incumbent businesses are in a very strong monopolized position and it's hard to break in. Or it could be that the industry requires and having lots of individual businesses, none of which are very big. So you have to understand this about the industry. But I do think in a busy marketplace that's saturating and quite noisy, you have to constantly reassert your value proposition to the customer. And often that comes from a growth mindset. It means not standing still and not resting on your laurels. On the flip side of that aggressive growth is also dangerous with unrealistic success goals, where you're just never going to achieve those numbers and they're not realistic. And I think a lot of people who have invested into coffee from a VC point of view, I think have been sold tech numbers, which were never going to happen for a physical product. I know Roland quite well, and I actually think Roland's rollout model is a more proven approach to rolling out and growing a business, which is it's a restaurant rollout, but of coffee shops. If you're a good operator who can find the right sites, and then when you have a brand where it's easier to get the right sites because key locations, especially if you're cosmopolitan driven and there's office blocks who want a coffee operator in their building, they're also going to contribute to fit out. Your brand is current. It adds value to their property. These kind of deals really help. And that's one of the biggest challenges of fast growth physical rollouts is getting the right sites. It's a very obvious thing to say, but it definitely hinders your growth, the ability to find the right sites. You can't stand completely still. I think aiming for hockey stick growth in the coffee industry is unrealistic for most. There'll be a few unicorns, but that will take most businesses under. So that puts us back in the middle of aiming for something which is a reasonable growth, a realistic ambition.
I love that. Realistic ambition, which to me sounds like, just as you mentioned, I like to be able to look at the wider trends, but also the business that I have, the people, the circle of customers and coworkers, et cetera, that I work with every day. That to me feels like it's more real. And it almost feels like there's this bifurcation of the industry where there's these unicorn models that are being chased because of what you mentioned as the winner's bias. But also, there are people who are really establishing in the industry smaller operations that are super community focused and maybe don't have the same ambition of global domination, almost as a reflex against it because they're worried they're going to miss something that is a little bit more speaking to the human condition.
I totally agree. And I think in those instances, the more contained project, they're worried about minimum viable scale, right? Which is, okay, I've got my project here. It's very defined and it's very contained. I'm not trying to roll it out and shift the needle of the whole industry. I'm just trying to make this project, which has value, sustainable and successful. That still needs its own form of growth, right? It needs to get its metrics right to survive. Back to the beginning of the conversation, there clearly is too small, right? There's clearly not enough cups of coffee sold a day or not enough grown at a farm. You're just not going to have a coffee farm business off of 2 hectares. It's only ever going to be a supplementary income, for example. So I think there's the growth side of things and there's the growing your project to the point where it works. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. What's good for the small is good for the large. It's just math, and it has to make sense either way.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of us have been finding out what our minimum viable structure is in a marketplace. I think a coffee shop's quite nicely contained, but a coffee roastery, for example, is really at a disadvantage if it's too small.
And it's one of those things that I imagine most people are looking at right now, where I do think a lot of people are exploring roasting as a way of increasing their ability to have multiple streams of income. Pandemic helps, put the fear into us, I think, in relying just on cups of coffee in a neighborhood. We want to have our online stores, our roasting, our catering, our product lines, and vertical integrated, everything in a sense. But I'm struck by this parallel when we're talking about it would be a mistake for you to not look at the graveyard of businesses around that unicorn model. And yet, when people are opening a coffee shop, that is one of those small community models that will maybe at best only ever have and should have 3 or 4 stores. And that's what they want, or 1 store or 2 stores. But they're looking to industry examples that are multinational companies that are inspirations. They'll use the word inspiration, but in a subtle way, that inspiration actually informs decisions that they make that they can't track why it didn't work, but it was because it came from that source.
100%. I mean, benchmarking is something I believe is important in business, full stop. And I believe it's important for individuals. Benchmark your role, your professional capabilities, your salary. Benchmarking in general is very valuable. But in an industry like ours, where you've got multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies down to a single site indie, obviously there's a huge range there. And to benchmark against the wrong part of the industry is not only not useful, it's going to be very damaging. Because I think a lot of us who run coffee businesses, especially further up the supply chain, are struggling to make something work. And then, often people mimic on price. I mean, I think this is very common across the supply chain. There's lots of benchmarked price, but that benchmark price is driven by those larger companies. And even if you can make your business work charging the same price as them, you're definitely not hitting the same GP or the same profit. You need to understand your project in isolation and try and understand how to make success out of it and almost treat it as a completely separate business. At the beginning of the book, I ask, what is specialty? Early I sort of say, well, anyone can buy specialty grade coffee. It's a grade of coffee. So large multinationals can, specialty coffee goes into Nespresso. I just had their £2.40, 20 year in the making, super rare Colombian pod. So really, I think when people say the specialty coffee industry, they're talking about boutique business and how those two things go together. Is that it's very common that we see specialty coffee engaged with and presented by boutique businesses. And I think if you understand yourself as a boutique business, at some point you may transition out of being a boutique business. But it's very common for people to go, okay, I think this is what you might have been alluding to earlier. We're not making money now. we're focusing on growing. And at some point, the bottom line will just figure itself out. I think that there couldn't be a more worse way to approach running a coffee business than that. I just honestly, like, I think it just doesn't happen. Of course, the EBITDA or the net profit of a larger revenue is more valuable, of course. This is the danger of talking about percentages. If I say 5%, which is in the book what I say a successful good year for a boutique coffee importer is, obviously that's not a lot, which is why they need to achieve scale. And then when you understand that, you go, okay, this whole narrative around green coffee traders being in the middle, they're not really taking much profit for their service. And you start to understand why they all are in Switzerland, because if it's such a low profit model, you need access to finance at low cost, which is Switzerland. But all I'm trying to say is 5% isn't a lot, but 5% is a lot of £1 billion, but it's not a lot of 100 grand. If you start a boutique green trader, I often say this to people after I wrote the book, I was like, phew, being a green trader is tough. And I sort of, when I would talk and chat to small boutique green traders, I'd be like, how are you making this work? And they would sort of share that same concern. And maybe we're going to see quite a bit of consolidation there, because it just doesn't stack up to run a really small green trader, especially against the risk. But then you take a cafe, for example, aiming for 15%, which would be a good result pre-tax. And you go, well, okay, if I'm going to run a coffee roastery and struggle to hit 8%, the coffee roastery needs to get to twice the revenue of the shop to make the same money. But I guess what I'm saying here is all these mechanics are really important. And often as you get bigger, you have new costs, new operational costs. It's very common. People talk about this in running multiple shops. There's tipping points where you have to have a head office of people who help you run those shops. And, their salaries are higher because their skill sets demand more value. So there was a guy called Joshua Dick who inherited Ernex, the family business, the cleaning business. He grew that and sold it. And he's moved to Italy and with his family, and he wrote a book called Grow Like a Lobster. And he uses the lobster as an analogy for business, which is to say that so a lobster has a fixed shell size, and so it can't expand as the lobster grows. So it has to shed the shell, during which time it's very vulnerable. And then it has to grow a new shell and grow into it. It does this many, many times in its life. And he's saying, well, this is what a business is like. So I don't want to confuse my point about loss making with the idea that there are going to be periods of time in your business, if your goal is to grow, where you will accept reduced profit as you're reinvesting in growth. But doing that without ever losing money is very different to running at large losses with the hope that at some point the revenue will uptick and it will all make sense, like a app or a software model.
So it sounds like the difference between hope and doing something on purpose is just that one is a slightly more informed decision that has some structure to it versus rolling into it and just kind of crossing your fingers.
100%. So we saw these business theories come out of Silicon Valley with the move fast and break things approach, right?
Yeah.
Which maybe people are not adopting as much as they used to. But that definitely doesn't work in coffee. And that's one of my points here, which is there are places for those business models. So I'm pretty negative on the D2C opportunity in coffee, especially for beans, for a bunch of reasons. And people often look at it and go, well, look, there's this amazing growth rate by, getting Facebook and Amazon ads right and getting the website funnel right. And the examples are never coffee. They are nearly always something else, like fast fashion or, makeup or toiletries. So in, the pure coffee game, which is you're either selling ingredients, which are coffee beans, whether you're upstream at the farm, importing or roasting, and then you get to the drink itself in the hospitality businesses. The move fast and break things doesn't apply to any of those businesses at all.
Kind of a surrogate for critical thinking and having a more slower growth that allows you that lobster model, I guess, is the expediency that tech provides. Something I've said on the show many times, that the examples we have in the industry sometimes are the biggest hurdle we have to success in the industry, because we see and we're connected to so many different ways to compare ourselves, where we spend our energy on that comparison rather than the curiosity of what's in front of us. But with tech, it feels like there's so much marketing around how now all of this growth is easy. Now you can have as much as you used to be able to have in 10 years in 1 year or something like that. So I'm curious from your perspective, in terms of technology as it applies to coffee shops and coffee roasteries today, how does tech fit into the health and growth of coffee companies? And maybe where does it actually hurt coffee companies?
Clearly, technology is everywhere. So it appears to me that the specialty coffee movement is very analog. And if you were to take the example of Spotify versus the surge in vinyl, specialty coffee sits more towards vinyl than Spotify. It's a nice analogy, but I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. We can think about technology in a few different ways. You've got like fundamental physical devices, which often we think about at a cafe level with equipment or automation. But then we've got communication platforms. When I was writing the book, and I interviewed a few different people who have been in the industry for many, many years and have worked across specialty to commercial. That was Rick Reinhardt. And he's mentioned way back in the day that he was having a conversation with Ted Lingle because email had just happened. And he was like, oh my God, this is going to change everything. Coffee farmers won't need to go through green traders anymore because they can connect directly with the buyer. And Ted Lingle was like, no, because the primary role of green exporter, importers, and traders is to finance the industry, and they still need the coffee to be financed. And he was right. But I've seen a massive change in when I got into coffee. And of course, I was younger in my career and I'd had less exposure to the whole supply chain. It definitely feels like the communication gap between coffee brands in the global south, so coffee brand producers and their customers in the global north, is smaller. And there's more and more of a narrative focus on the producer. Of course, the producers who are the best positioned business-wise to do this are those that are well resourced already, typically speak English, and are traveling the world, going to trade shows with their premium coffee farm brand. That's definitely evolved. We often think about the customer as the end customer, right? But obviously, the roaster is a customer of the farmer. So the B2B sales is all linked into B2C. There's a flow-through effect, which is one theory, which is, if a brand establishes itself at the beginning, I think this is really common in specialty, by the way, which is a farm, either a coffee or a story resonates with roasters. The roasters promote that, so they are almost an agency for that producer brand. But that brand then starts to gain resonance with the end consumer to a point where other B2B brands now want that brand because their customers want it. Specialty at the pointy end is much more curated. So whether it's a coffee shop or a roasting brand or even a green importer, the boutique pointy end are basically curating coffees for their customers and telling them what they think they should drink. They go, we think this is good because of this. But then at the mass end, you have the opposite happening. So Costa Coffee in the UK, huge, were owned by Whitbread and got bought by Coca-Cola. They recently changed their roast to be darker, their main coffee, their house coffee, for the first time in, I don't know, it must be 40 years. And I said to them, how did you make that decision? Such a big decision. And they said, well, 4 years of blind taste trials in our cafe. So they're not trying to curate anything. They are just interested in what customers statistically want. Very different approaches. And I think we see both of those approaches in specialty mixed into each other. But I think technology plays into access to market, to bring it back to technology. And that's the biggest thing here. Just because you create specialty coffee, whether you're a farmer, an importer, or a roaster, or a cafe, the fact you created it doesn't mean it sells. We talk often about it as though it has inherent value. So like, this will sell. It's like, well, you still have to access the market and access the customers for that product, right? I do think that technology has and continues to change that dynamic, mostly in positive ways. There's some negatives to it as well. And I think often with all technology, the grass is greener. We create a piece of technology to solve a problem without realizing that we probably lose something at the same time. Hopefully, we end up in a mass balance where we're better off than where we started. Then I think about like negative technologies there. People talk about direct trade all the time, and often there's a lack of appreciation that there are functions happening with the traditional trading model that are valuable, and maybe the right solution is a hybrid model at the end. When I think of coffee shops, I think of automation. I've questioned how much automation will be adopted in specialty for a long time because I think there's quite a few trade-offs. I think it's the same with specialty, right? And often it's about us overvaluing convenience. So if I take instant coffee and say, okay, this is the hardest possible way to make coffee as a manufacturer. You've got to brew it, dehydrate it. It's the hardest way to make it taste good. It's the most expensive way to make it. So the proposition to the customer is this is going to be the worst version of this coffee you're going to have out of all the ways you could have it.
Yes, I very much agree with you.
So you're saying to the customer, hey, this is the worst way you could have this coffee, and it's the most expensive per cup, but it's the most convenient. So the whole thing is relying on convenience as a value, which is quite simply, I think we're seeing, is overplaying the value of convenience. It's a misunderstanding of that, of the value there. Whereas coffee pods are interesting because there is increased value to doing some of the job for the customer without as much of a detriment to quality, and also a price point which doesn't go past the price ceiling or the elasticity of the customer's appetite to pay for something. So, but then I think about in the coffee shops, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's a barista champion who was like, oh, we've put Eversys into our new coffee shop. It's a different brand and it's amazing. And my question generally to each of these people is, what do you think you're losing? And they're sort of like, well, nothing, and maybe a bit of theatre. I'm like, yeah, okay. So my main worry with automation from a business point of view is I've got a kind of brand where if we decide to put a bit of technology in, I'm not worried that the customer won't think it's authentic because we'll tell them why it is. Not every coffee brand feels it's in that position to take its customer through that, and they need to react more to what the customer perceives as the way quality is achieved through visual cues or so on and so forth. But my biggest worry about the automation is staff engagement. That's my biggest concern, because so much of the value of specialty coffee businesses in bricks and mortar is engagement with baristas and the team. And they're engaged because they're working in an engaged way with a product. So right back in Melbourne, I found it interesting making coffee. And I was really interested in it. I'd done some not monotonous jobs, right? So I had done kiwi flower picking in New Zealand, and I had done vine pruning. And these were like challenges to my ability to like meditate, because they were so mind numbing. I was just like, oh, this is just monotonous. For some reason, the process of preparing and serving coffee to customers, I was like, yeah, this is quite repetitive, especially in a busy shop. And I know there's limits here. It's very different to make coffee in a shop with 200 cups a day to 1,000. But I was like, this is interesting and it's engaging. And I definitely think my entry point into coffee came through touching something with my hands and engaging with it physically. And there's a book called The Craftsman about the value of humans doing things with their hands. We look at all the things we can save with automation, go, ooh, we can reduce staff costs, we can increase consistency, we can do these other things. But like, what are you losing? And this barista champion's answer to me was, oh, Max, I went and worked there last week. It was great. And I was like, well, yeah, but you went and worked there for a week and then you left to go to Panama and taste geishas and then go to South Korea to train someone to be a barista champion. Like, what's it like to work with that equipment in that environment for 18 months, right? And so, again, this is the same thing with home brewers, right? For a long time pre-COVID, it was like people at home don't want to make coffee. And then COVID happens and goes, oh, look, they do it. And of course, there's different character types. And these generalizations are part of coffee's problem. There's a friend of mine who was a product designer at Dyson, the vacuum machine makers, an innovative British consumer goods company. And he said they were looking at coffee and he said, oh, I've never seen a more segmented market. There's so many different types of customers who engage with different preparation methods in different ways. They're all coffee drinkers, but there's so many different customer cohorts. Actually, the trend I see at sort of pointy boutique coffee is I don't see automation. I actually see pieces of technology that are used to deconstruct coffee making, because I think the shop and the baristas and the head of coffee, whoever they are, they want that control to play around with coffee theory. Whereas if you commit to a fully automated system, you're locking yourself into a way of making and preparing coffee, unless you want to replace that equipment, right? You can't play around with frozen coffee, play around with distribution techniques. I know a lot of people who are business owners might be like, well, that stuff's a distraction from my business. And I'm like, I come at it from both ends. I'm a fascinated coffee lover who's done barista comps and also a business owner. So maybe I'm a bit biased, but I see a lot of value in staff interacting with the product on a level that's rewarding for them.
I'm nodding my head vigorously here as you talk. We just released a shift break on why we need inconvenient coffee. And so this has been something that's been kind of gnawing at me for a while. So I'm really glad that you're mentioning it, especially the idea that, use whatever analogy you want, astronauts have to have weight training in space because of the lack of resistance, and that we're created for resistance. We're set up for it. The artful application of necessary resistance throughout the life of, person, let alone an organization that is made up of people, is not something that we can innovate our way out of, because it seems to just keep coming back over and over again. It's not like we're going to trick the matrix or something to allow us to get rid of the problems that develop the wisdom that create longevity. So yes, that makes total sense to me.
Definitely that double-edged sword of technology and innovation, solving one thing for us and taking something away. I don't know if you know, one of my hobbies outside of coffee is weightlifting. And I had a coffee producer get in touch with me to say thanks for, championing the idea of some manual lifting, because obviously we live in a world where you're almost encouraged to lift nothing, right?
That's right.
People on Instagram message me like, you're going to destroy your back and stuff. To your point just then, and my point about making 1,000 cups of coffee versus 200, there are limits, and there are points where it veers into injury or RSO or overworking. But that doesn't null and void the whole process. It's about a balance of, to your point about, what is a positive amount of friction, and it's about dosage and thresholds. Ever since I got into coffee, I was surprised at how philosophical it was just to make people cups of coffee. So my take on automation is that specialty coffee is a community of businesses and individuals embracing automation as a delivery format for specialty coffee is widening the environments that those coffee brands are doing business in. I don't think it's should or will replace the place they were crafting coffee before.
Well said. Yeah. So when we think about these next few years in coffee, knowing what we know about how the market has played out with business and what we know about business now from many mistakes that we've made and, whatever the demand is from the market and how we interpret it, where do you see brick and mortar retailers fitting into the industry in the coming years? A lot of people are, it's, just going to be, like we mentioned, automation, and walking into a store is going to be an antiquated thing. I don't necessarily agree myself, but brick and mortar retailers, I feel like, are having an identity crisis when it comes to how we translate specialty coffee to our communities, our customers, in light of where the greater industry is. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm so positive about bricks and mortar coffee. I find myself in this exploration of coffee business moving forward to conceptually think about the industry. And I often find myself coming back to fundamentals. There's a lot of novelty built into the specialty movement, and there's almost a desire for a lot of change and novelty. I think that's interesting because you can't keep doing that. At some point, some of your ideas of quality become established. And yeah, culturally, that means a shift. It means a change. I think one of the most valuable places in the whole supply chain and in the coffee industry is bricks and mortar. It's those experiences. And maybe I'm a little bit biased because I love them so much. And as I've worked back through the supply chain, that magic for me of a coffee shop is unique to the shops. I was writing this book and I was talking about the challenges of D2C business because you're selling an ingredient and that means that the lifetime value is low. I've got a friend of mine who's runs an olive oil company, very big one in the UK, and they do Mediterranean ingredients. They're selling an ingredient too. People buy a bottle of olive oil and they use it over a period of time. These ingredients businesses struggle in a few ways. They struggle with lifetime value because if they put loads of money in branding straight to the consumer, they are not going to get it back because it's not like buying a can of craft beer, drinking it in 15 minutes and then opening the next can, but also in terms of how people use your product. So I think that it's a very natural thing for coffee brands to want to have their own bricks and mortar, to speak directly to customers. Those businesses can generate revenue themselves. And also you can present the coffees in the way that you'd like to as a coffee brand. I think when I look across the whole supply chain, there's so many things happening here. So I talked to Pedro at Pergamino in Colombia, and it's all about marketplace. So you're talking about America, UK, global north, global south. We can talk about coffee shops a bit more generically around the world than we can coffee farming. Coffee farming is so contextual. A large Latin American producer is nothing like a smallholder in rural Africa, depending on the African country. But when I talked to him, I said, okay, what are you doing with your coffee? And he said, well, his focus is to grow less coffee on the land, because actually when you get to a certain point, harvesting labor is a problem. So quality goes down. Unless you're like Brazil and you can automate it, if you can't invest in all that equipment, your land's not as flat. Maybe the tipping point for good scale coffee farm is about 30 hectares. That's Alejandro from Caravella thinks it might be 30 hectares. And so then Pedro is going, okay, he's now got a roastery in Colombia. And a friend of mine, Simon, who moved to Peru with his partner and family, They own a small farm in Peru and they're selling to local roasters. And if you're the coffee farmer, you would rather sell internally because you don't have the volatility of the market. But then he's got 8 coffee shops and a roastery. He can sell to his own roastery and his own coffee shops. It's like a fully integrated coffee company from farm to cup. And agritourism, quite a few of the CAGRs, which is a mark for the overall growth of a marketplace, cite agritourism as part of the growth of coffee. So using less of his land to grow coffee, agritourism, his own coffee shops, his own roastery. I think you're looking at these levers and you're going, well, coffee shops are really, really valuable way to connect with the customer for telling a coffee story. And, specialty coffee is so much about narrative as well as it is about cup quality, that it feels like there's no better place to do that than in a coffee shop. There just isn't a better place to do it, where you can curate and control that experience. And I was writing this and talking about how valuable bricks and mortar is from a marketing point of view for any business, that as I wrote the book, I decided, okay, we don't do any ad spend anymore and we charge all our online customers shipping. You definitely lose some customers, but it makes sense. That's when I decided I wanted to open the shop in London. I was like, I think I need another shop. The shops make so much sense. And I'm not saying the trading scenario in shops is easy, but the general macroeconomic trading scenario is not great around the world. But I don't think shops are the hardest place to be. I think for years, if I look at the UK market, I don't know how much I would compare America. I'm sure there's quite some similarities there, is that we had a boom of third wave coffee shops, not just in the UK, but Europe. And this was pre-Brexit. And it's much easier to open an interesting coffee shop and find a roaster that's doing something interesting than it is to start roasting your own, especially if you respect how difficult it is to do that. And so for a long time, there was a shortage in supply for what was high demand for specialty coffee. And these coffee roasteries you speak to, they said, 15 years ago, you just buy some nice coffee, roast it fresh and stick it in a brown bag, and you just couldn't do it quick enough. The thing about those businesses, though, is they very quickly are in competition with each other because you can ship coffee around, they're less location dependent. What I find amazing about coffee shops is they're the most location dependent in the chain, which is a good and a bad thing. But if your average customer is only going to come to you within a 1 mile radius, and even destination coffee shops like mine, I have to be close to a transport hub or something. I'm not actually competing with that many businesses. I mean, who's doing a similar proposition to me in that area? I don't know, like 3 shops, 4 shops. And so I actually think that this is definitely the case in the UK. The general population in the UK are definitely still underserved with boutique specialty coffee shops. Now, you could take a saturated part of London and say, well, it's not true. It's like, okay, fine. Go outside of London. The same trend that we've seen with YouTube, that there is actually a way bigger appetite for boutique coffee than people thought. I mean, I admit, when I got into coffee, I never thought the appetite was as big as it is now. Definitely not. But I was like, okay, I come from the art background. I'm like, okay, maybe there's a confined thing we can do here, which is valuable. And it's just blown up outside of that. But that same trend on YouTube suggests a wider appetite, pop culture appetite for boutique coffee. I don't know if you had this advert in the US, but we had this advert by McDonald's in the UK. I can't remember how many years ago now, 5 or 6 years. The advert was taking the mick, a humorous take, a satire on independent coffee shops. The customer was going in, they didn't understand the menu, they didn't get the drink they wanted. And at the end of the advert, they walk into a McDonald's and go, can I just have a coffee? Why I really like the advert is McDonald's clearly think this movement is recognizable enough to enough of its customer base that it's going to build an ad campaign around it. But it's acknowledging the segmentation of the market. And, at some point, like that CEO I mentioned earlier, when he said, when this is all over, at some point the market will become quite saturated and not show the same growth. But I think for the next 10 to 20 years, even in developed countries like America, UK is not as developed as America, but Australia, I still think there is growth there at a bricks and mortar level to serve populations who want this product and want that individual experience. When you said about growth earlier, and you talked about scaling quality, I put a chapter in the book about this idea of scaling quality. And I mean, quality is too broad a word. What do you mean? So if you take a specific confined experience of an operator and their team with the coffees they're buying, that probably isn't scalable. Like, the culture of that business will change as it gets bigger. But I think that's a natural movement of the market where new independent operators come in and feed that marketplace. Also, there are some operators who literally have no interest in growing, and it's more like the European restaurant model where you go, okay, I'm going to open this and run it for 30, 40 years, and it's going to be contained and I love coming to work every day and I love my business. And I think we see more of that attitude in Europe, at least the people I speak to in America. There's much more appetite for a larger multi-site growth business in America. So I think there's like an equilibrium here. There is growth there. I'm excited by it. The whole thing starts with demand, right? So I talk about in the book about price ceilings and elasticity and what can we charge for a cup of coffee. Now, this bit is a bit of a concern. So I say we have cost of living crisis, inflation, and I say to my team at the roastery, if you didn't work here and you didn't work in coffee, but you had the salary you got here, would you buy our subscription? And they were like, well, of course not. It's too expensive. So I think often it's like, who is the customer? What's the appetite for price? And I spoke to Carl Weinhold, who wrote Cheap Coffee. He was based out in Colombia, and now he's based in, I think it's Portugal or Spain, doing some kind of research project where he is on a research salary. And he said when he was out in Colombia working with the coffee, because a lot of us, when we work with coffee, we get access to it, right? We can just drink it. We can just steal our own supply. So we don't really understand the customer proposition very well because we're not the customer. He's completely changed his mind on it. He's gone, yeah, on my research salary, I can't buy those coffees. I've had to buy cheaper coffees. And so I do think, it's naive to think everyone can pay more for coffee. And when you sort of understand the price elasticity and the ceiling prices in the market, you can better understand it. I think the businesses that typically explore price ceiling the least are bricks and mortar coffee shops. I did an Instagram survey saying, to independent coffee shop owners or baristas, do you think you charge less or more than the local multiple chain, which would be, Starbucks, Costa, etc. Without fail, most of them hadn't been in a Starbucks or a Costa for a long time and didn't know the price, but also made the assumption they charged more. And then nearly in every case, when you go and research it, they were charging less. You have to recognize from a business point of view, those mainstream brands have built a brand that has value, which means, and I can tell you, they're definitely testing the market and pushing their prices to figure out what that price ceiling is. And I think there's a strange thing that often happens with indies where a lot of their customers are potentially cynical customers or customers who are like, okay, I don't think I'm going to get what I want from the chain. I don't trust that brand. I actually think they're overcharging. I'm going to go to the indie where I want a better product for less money, which is a sort of strange scenario. I can't prove this statistically. It's just my speculation as to what's happening. I definitely think that the challenge with having a small independent business is confidence. Right? If you've got one or two shops and talking about benchmarking, a lot of the pricing is done on mimicry. It's going, what do the other businesses around us charge? And then building your pricing around that. But I think a lot of boutique specialty coffee businesses, not all of them, but a lot, don't push that price ceiling and do undercharge. So obviously your idea of how successful your coffee shop can or cannot be is based on, your bottom line and how much of a struggle it is. I wonder how much of that comes from not a properly explored price ceiling.
It's interesting because it comes back to those principles of just good business, whether it's a coffee shop or not, where the universal need for people to be customers of craft or craftspeople themselves, I think, is at play here, where we then have to marry that with good business practices that will allow us, coming right back to the beginning here, to continue that vision and have it evolve and mature, and that curiosity that guides so many experiments, and giving ourselves permission to push either the price ceiling or the value proposition and be innovative with who it is we're serving and how we're going to serve them better and better. When I look at your book, it's the holistic view of business in coffee.
When you mentioned at the beginning of that question about how I feel about bricks and mortar, and I think you suggested maybe that there was some, either conversations or a feedback loop that you were hearing from people about some reticent about the opportunity of bricks and mortar. Would you describe those as experienced operators or?
I would say online retailers and people who have bricks and mortars have online retail. That's fine. But there are many models of coffee that are, I think, removed from the customer experience. In some cases, a lot of drive-through experiences can be a little removed from the brick and mortar customer experience. In fact, when you're talking with people and people talk to me about this, where they say, well, I have a drive-through, but I'm going to open a brick and mortar soon. So the distinction is made in the industry by saying there's this distant service model that is very assembly line-esque, if you will. And then there's a model where we put the mod bar in and we all are about access to the customer and we want to like serve the customer. That's not exclusive to just brick and mortar. I think people in drive-throughs do it too, but that's kind of where I'm getting that from.
No, it's a really interesting point because I think there's two things here, which is perspective of opportunity over time. And then there's also this idea of ownership of a narrative, right? So, the drive-through model, I can see specialty drive-through coffee not being well received by a craft-driven traditional operator, right? Is the drive-through taking trade away from them? Probably not. Is it expanding where specialty coffee gets sold? Yes. So are they negative about it because of the culture of specialty coffee? From a business point of view, I would imagine that shows a growing market, and it shows that there's an appetite for specialty coffee to go across multiple channels and formats where it wasn't necessarily as prevalent before.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that.
And then I think there's also an interesting thing about operators. So I did a video a few years ago when I had a little stab at long form ranty YouTube videos about this race to the bottom. And what's really interesting is a business owner's perspective is relative to their current position. At some point, every year you open, the first year, whatever growth you have is growth. And then years 3, 4, 5 towards 10 and beyond, it's harder to hit 50% growth when you're turning over $1 million than it is to hit 50% growth when you're turning over 100 grand. And so this perspective changes over time. If you want to maintain that same growth rate, you have to change your behavior. Back to right at the beginning of the conversation, maybe you compromise what you're doing. Are you really growing specialty, or are you actually diversifying your product portfolio to more commercial coffee to access a customer that you now need to maintain the growth that you've decided you need, which you didn't need when you were smaller because you could get the growth just from specialty? But this perspective is interesting to me because unless you break through, there's this thing that happens. I think for a business to start and get some momentum, I think is quite easy. And that's obviously very exciting. And for that individual, they feel like the coffee industry is alive and it's so exciting. And then, back to the lobster thing, there's going to be times in that coffee company's journey where it's much harder to grow, or even a flat year is, you're like, okay, at least we were flat. We didn't grow, but we didn't lose. And then there's some companies that will break through and start to scale massively. And so the perspective I think is unique to each of the operators. And this is one of the things that writing this book that was clear to me is, and I knew this about myself anyway, but it was talking to other people at either writing this book or now that I've written it and speaking to people at events. Business is so personal. For all of the entrepreneurs and individual operators, a discussion around the marketplace and strategy is a direct discussion around their identity because their business is such a big part of their identity. So if they're having a difficult challenge doing what they want to do with their business, obviously that's distressing and your business isn't where you need it to be for whatever reason. A lot of the conversation around where the industry is or isn't very statistical. It's often individual anecdote around where each of us are exploring the industry through our personal businesses, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's always going to be the balance to edit ourselves and our assumptions with good information. That's ultimately why I think this book is so valuable because, especially as it's created by somebody with an artistic bent as yourself, it has a lot of the foundations of principles of business explored in it that allow people to kind of resonate with that artistic side, but also, sustain their business with a more in-depth perspective. And so this whole conversation, obviously, I feel like at the beginning I said it's not fair because we have a limited time, but at the same time, there's like 5 podcasts or more worth of things we can discuss. But it's been really amazing to just have this conversation with you. I would invite you to a great asset for the industry, this book, because I really do think this is a...
Thanks, Chris. It's been great to talk to you as well. And I always love discussing complex ideas with people, and listening to the way you framed some of those concepts today was making me think about it in a slightly different way as well, which I think is, and I'm a big believer of conversation and discussion. And I look at my coffee career and a lot of it's collaboration and learning from other people. So one of my goals with the book was not to be prescriptive, but to help encourage positive discussion around the business of specialty coffee. But also, what you just said there about the artistic approach is, I think I would have fallen into this camp early, which is the business language and the way business discussion often happens didn't resonate with me personally as a more artistic person. I hope that I'm able to take some business ideas and connect with specialty coffee passionate business owners or creative people in a way that's useful that they may not have had before. And the book in the US, I had a lot of support early from Scott Rao, who helped me find the best printer, and he's going to be distributing it in North America. So it's easy to pick it up off of him rather than try and get it shipped from the UK from me. I'm super excited as well to see what conversations I get out of it. When I wrote Water for Coffee, and what I love about these projects is you put them out into the world, and that's not the end of it. In fact, in many ways, it's the beginning of discussing that subject in a way that you couldn't before.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing that myself, and it is obviously a great work. And I'm grateful for you discussing it with us here today, Maxwell. Thank you so much.
That's my pleasure. Till next time.
All right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. Lots more we could talk about. The book is just packed with a ton of information. This is one of those books that I feel should be on everybody's shelf if you are serious about coffee or coffee shops. And even if you're just fascinated with coffee shops, this is one of those things that is a must-have. And just throughout this conversation, as we kind of come back to again and again, the importance to cultivate an understanding around the business part of coffee so that the values and the artistic and the social, the relationships all can have a firm and strong, sustainable foundation. This needs to be our focus as we move forward as an industry and as individuals within it. All of our innovation in our work in coffee, it's about people, and it's about making sure that we are securing the platforms and businesses that we create with good practices and great perspectives. And I'm so thankful to have had Maxwell on the show to share about that very thing. So big thank you to Maxwell. And if you are interested, and I hope you are, in getting this book, then you can find this book over on Scott Rao's website, scottrao.com. I would encourage you also to follow Maxwell on Instagram. That's Colonna-Dashwood on Instagram. And you can find all of these links for Maxwell and the book over on the show notes for this episode. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about today's episode, then please do reach out, chris@keystotheshop.com. If you're an operator of a coffee shop and you are interested in improving your operations, your people, and your quality in your shop, and you need an advisor and coaching on how to do just that, then go ahead and reach out, chris@keystotheshop.com, to set up a free discovery call for Keys to the Shop Consulting. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today on this episode. Super glad to have you along. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the show, share it with friends and with your followers. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.